Thank you for joining us. And we said that today the presentation and the lecture, we wanted to really give emphasis on your book, on your thinking, and I'm so thankful that you took this invitation.
And I'm very thankful for this opportunity. Thank you.
So without long ado, please join me in welcoming Valentina Ivancich, who is Doctor of Science and also we call plant neuropsychologist in our artistic approach.
Well, and I'll try to speak clearly and I hope in an interesting way about the work I do.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, is the microphone okay?
Yeah, I'm just afraid that you have to have it quite close in order to hear.
This okay?
Yeah, I think it's fine, no?
Yeah, I have a bad relationship with microphones. I was too far from them. Thank you.
Okay.
So, labas vakaras, buonasera, good evening. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak at the Swamp School third chapter. And at the very beginning, I'm very, very honored about this. So I'm here to speak about my work and my book that was lately published on this work. Since I was invited to speak here, I tried to focus also on the work of the Pavillion. So I titled my lecture Us and Trees, Cohabitation as a Vital Necessity. Us and Trees is basically a very rough translation of my book's title, which is somewhere here, excuse me, yes, whose cover you will shortly see in the presentation. And I took, of course, the cohabitation part of the subtitle from the manifesto, in a way, of the program of the Swamp Pavillion. So let's speak a little bit about myself first and how I came to write this book. As you saw in this title page, I actually graduated in medicine, and I practiced as a child psychiatrist for a while. And also gained a doctorate in neuroscience. But together with all this, in parallel to all this, I always loved plants. It was a bit more than a personal passion, because I worked with plants and in gardens, both personally and in my professional life, and actually formalized this also in a degree at some stage. So the work and the book comes from a merging of these two focuses of my life and experience. Now, the interesting thing was how my work is relevant to the work being done here and being brought forward in the program through all these months of the Biennale. Of course, I see it from the focus of trees and plant life and the natural environment and what these mean for us human beings. As a doctor, of course, I'm concerned with the well-being of human beings, the health in the more total sense, comprising all levels of experience and human structure. And what I plan to point out is that actually cohabitation is indeed vital and necessary, because there exist some very, very strong ties and links between the human being in all levels of structure and the natural world, and these exist whether we're aware of them or not, which poses a series of interesting problems for modern humanity. So again, to link my work and the Pavillion's work, I've tried to read as much as possible when I learned that I was to give this lecture. And one sentence in the website struck me particularly, and it's the sentence that's highlighted here. I'll read it out to you. In a time marked by existential threats of war and climate change, the Pavilion will highlight the vital urgency of human cohabitation with other forms of life. So, as I said, I found this quote particularly striking because there are several points in which they highlight the overlaps, the common ground between our two approaches to perhaps a problem that's not so different. It's actually the same. And in the highlighted parts of the text, there are points I'd like to discuss to begin with. First is the existential threats part. That here are explicited as war and climate change. There's so much in the modern world that gives a sense of insecurity and instability, and basically of there being no solid ground to stand on. The threat of extinction, the shifting certainties. This is particularly strong nowadays. And in a way, the tree in my title, the tree concept in my work, could be seen in a way as an antinomy, because the tree, of course, is a concept of stability, of solidity. It's a living being that also gives shelter and structure, that holds in place both the soil, in a way, a very solid way, but also communities. It's also something that transcends, that goes across several generations, lives for several generations of human lives, so it's something that gives a sense of eternity in a way. This, of course, in human history is symbolically very important and significant. Many myths and religions and collective and individual psychology give a very strong importance to the tree as a symbol, of course. But the tree concept can also be read as, in a way, synonymous to this, what was quoted before, because the existential threats, as explicited in the Pavillion's work, are more, if I understand correctly, more global and exterior threats. In my work, I'm also concerned with threats to the humankind's integrity, but perhaps more individual, social, even biological and interior threats. But both are threats to the integrity of humankind. And both make it indispensable that we worked on this concept of contact and relationship with other forms of life, which is cohabitation. The vital urgency of human cohabitation with other forms of life, which was the other part of the highlighted text, is another part of very strongly defined common ground, I think. Because in my work, what I state is that coexistence, cohabitation is indeed very urgent, and actually it's a necessity. Now, for clarity, I actually took a piece of definition from a dictionary of the word necessity. It has several possible meanings, closely related meanings, and I think that coexistence and cohabitation is a necessity for humankind. Perhaps in all the senses that are, all the significations that are highlighted, that are stated here. We must find pathways to coexistence with other forms of life, because this is a required and unavoidable process if we are to survive as humankind. But it's also indispensable, as I hope to show in the rest of the lecture, because it seems that the human body, biology, at all levels, physiology, metabolism, hormone production, even our intelligence, our mind structure, things even in the balance of social relationship. There are so many things that define us as human beings that actually seem to depend on us having a certain degree of good quality coexistence with other forms of life. These, in short, I will put under the umbrella term tree. Also, literally, it's a sort of umbrella shape, because it's a strong symbol. Because much of the work and research that's been done on this has worked in forests and woods, so the tree has been an important thing, both literally and also symbolically. But of course, I'm also talking about cohabitation in general between humankind and other forms of life. So, in short, this was why I took the cohabitation term from the Pavillion program and tried to use it in my lecture, and tried to show how this is actually a reading one can give to what I wrote about in this book. Because cohabitation and coexistence, of course, when you read about it in the paper, they usually mean human-human cohabitation, which is of course vital and important, but it also means cohabitation, as I've been saying, between humans and other life forms. So, us and trees, which is roughly translated the title of my book. So, us and trees, there's a comma in the middle, because basically, if you think of it, one of the problems is with us modern Western post-industrial people is that we actually see nature a bit as something a bit separate. This is a classical philosophical concept, and there's endless discussion about this, but basically we are here, nature is there, we look at it, it's beautiful, but there's a certain distance, there's a certain abstraction. An example of this is the recent success we've had. There's been in the world, there's been a huge success of book on the forest as a community of living beings, and he's not talking about the animals, he's talking about the plants. This is a very interesting book, it's a fascinating book. It has sold millions of copies worldwide, so there is a lot of interest and a lot of even emotion in us humans about nature and other forms of life, but it's still something a bit separate. It's the forest that's working as a community. It's basically a lovely backdrop in the best of cases. It's something that's there at the back of the scene while we're on stage and we're playing out our lives, but it's inert. It doesn't really interact with us. We need to really step beyond this dividing line. We actually part of the same community, and we live under the same influences. And this second point is really important. Whether we're aware of it, or as often happens, we're not, and nowadays we're often not. There is a form of communication, not only among trees of the forest and living beings, but in a way also between the trees and us humans. Don't imagine it as the tree speaking to us, because that's not it at all, but there are ties, and severing these ties is actually quite dangerous, and I'll speak of these dangers in a very sort of medical way, in a way. There's something, this is another way of saying what I've already just stated. I hope I'll be able to demonstrate it, but anyway, there's something deeply embedded in the human constitution which links us to other life forms at all structural levels. And this might seem like a bit of a far-fetched statement, but there are some very concrete and tangible examples. Now I'd like to propose, first of all, to observe this picture. What can you see in this picture? Of course, first thing, very few trees, but that's not my point. My thing is, I wanted to point out the urban guerrilla part of the picture. Now this is a picture of riots that broke out a few years ago in Turkey, in the capital, Istanbul. You might remember there were very large, widespread not really urban guerrilla, but anyway, riots and protests that were more or less peaceful according to the moment. They lasted many days. They spread to many areas of the cities and involved many people. And they were only suppressed after a long time, with great difficulty, unfortunately, also with some deaths. Now the analysis of the whys and hows and the political reason behind all this, that's not our place to discuss this. My point is that all this was triggered by the destruction of a public garden. This massive outburst of public emotion, of public rage, began because somebody came with a chainsaw to destroy the Gezi Park. This series of protests is now called the Gezi Park riots. So, my point is in that very large, very densely populated city that grew extensively to millions, even I think 14 million people in a rather short time, about 10 years, there was this impressive outburst of mass emotion that was triggered by a threat to trees and public green space. And what's the moral in all this? That there are deep emotional ties that exist between us humans and the living elements of our world, our direct environment. I mean, trees, plants, living elements that live around us. These take a profound psychological significance, conscious or more often unconscious, and they clearly influence our state of mind, as we just saw. Another example in another continent and a totally different situation, of course, is in New York. After September 11, when they cleared out the rubble, of course, everything was destroyed under there, including any trees in the street or gardens that existed. In taking away the remains, the rubble, to clear the ground, somebody noticed that one of the tree stumps was actually living. It had put out a little branch with new leaves. And this, you can imagine the times, I mean, the shock, the grief. There was a time of national emergency. It was a very, very difficult moment for that great country, America. But there was still a total unanimity, no doubt whatsoever. This tree had to be saved. And so these poor remains were taken away with the greatest care and considerable difficulty and expense, taken to a national arboretum, taken care of, and they're actually saved. And now the tree stands in the middle of the memorial garden and is a focus of pilgrimage and a symbol of resilience and survival. To take again the sentence, to repeat myself, basically, these ties, these links that still bind us and the natural world exert an influence and play a role at all levels of structure. And now we have given examples from the psychological plane of experience, emotion, psychology, mass outbursts of mass rage, or of mass motivation. But there is more. That's not the only level at which we are tied to plants and trees and other life forms, and at which they exert an influence on us, in short, in which we communicate. This little fellow has a beautiful color, and it's called the emerald ash borer. And it's a parasite of the ash tree, of trees of the ash family. Now, this parasite that actually originates from somewhere else arrived in North America in the early 90s. And it's a very destructive insect. Once it arrives on the plant, the tree is killed in a year and a half maximum. So the spread of this parasite was actually quite dramatic, because it turned the leafy suburbs and cities of many parts of the United States, where the ash tree is very much present as a member of the urban forest, the tree present in urban areas. It turned them from something like this typical suburban road, to something looking a bit more like this. It's not the same road, of course, I just took it as an example. Now, this, of course, was a tragedy, but it was also a great opportunity for scientists who study the effects of nature or loss of nature on human health. Because we had a case where, on a very wide area, a large number of people could be studied without moving them from that. They still lived in different places, they did different work, they were from different walks of life, different economic conditions. They had this in common, that at certain moments in time they lived with so much trees around them. Year after, there were so many less trees. Now this gave an opportunity to do some research on the health statistics. The loss of trees was correlated to the morbidity and mortality rates. That is, how many people per year get sick of particular diseases and how many people die. These are data, health data that are collected as a routine in all civilized countries. And what happened after the collection of all data and after, of course, careful statistical analysis was that there was a really very significant correlation between the loss of trees and the mortality rates, in particular for two sort of problems, cardiovascular problems and respiratory problems, but also overall. So basically, loss of tree means more human deaths. There is more. We know now that loss of tree is linked to us being more inclined to get sick and die. But the opposite is also true. So the presence of trees has an effect on the healing process. And we are a bit more accustomed to thinking of this on a psychological plane. There's a lot of work on horticultural therapy for psychiatric patients and so on. But it's also true actually in a very tangible physical plane. Now, classic experiment was done with surgery patients of a hospital in North America. A researcher called Ulrich, Professor Ulrich, took all patients that had undergone the same kind of surgery in the same hospital, and it was rather routine surgery, so it was nothing too difficult, something that was always done in the same way, and divided all these patients according to the view they had from their hospital window. So whether their hospital room had a window that opened on the garden, or on a planted there, or on parking lots, unplanted courtyards, and so on. And the healing process of the people who looked at trees and green stuff from their window was significantly shorter and significantly easier. By easier I mean that they had less complications, less frequent complications, they had less need of painkillers and drugs, and in short everything seemed to work much better. And they also left the hospital earlier because their healing was quicker. So presence of trees boosts healing processes, physical healing processes, and we actually have here two examples of how our ties to the natural world speak at all two different levels, but that are one with our human structure, holistically one within our human structure. So this is basically a hospital as it shouldn't be. This is of course, architectural projection, but the empty spaces were actually supposed to be parking. And this is no good. And now a nice, really innovative hospital always has lots of green space around it, even has dedicated therapeutic gardens. That is, gardens that are explicitly created for therapeutic purposes. Again, I'll state it and I'll repeat it, and you'll probably be terribly bored with me for repeating it so often, but there are strong and deep ties that link us humans and non-human living natural elements in a thing that we could even call a communication. And it is something that affects us holistically. Mind, body, it even affects social interaction. I don't think I'll have time to talk about, but we also have evidence for that. Now, in plant neuropsychology, we usually mean to work on the interactions of plants with each other and their way of acting and reacting to their environment. Here, I'm talking more, my focus is more on the interactions of humans and plants and the effects of the presence and absence of trees, gardens, parks, and so on people's health and well-being. Now, this is all very interesting and very well, but we might wonder, we've seen effects now, we might wonder at this stage what this communication is like and what actually happens to us when we go for a walk in a wood. Well, lots of interesting things happen, and we have the luck of having research that's being done on the field, and that's pretty mind-blowing in my opinion. But it's first, just for a little, this is correct me if I'm saying things that are not right, but I'm totally fascinated by the ideogram for tree that is, well, very clearly a stylized tree. Then a grove, which is a group of a few trees, is written by 2 ideograms for trees, while the forest, which is many trees, there are 3. I think this is absolutely wonderful. Now, why am I saying this? Because a lot of the research that was done on what happens to the human body and to the human mind when it is in close contact with nature was done in the Far East, and much of it was done in Japan. This is a wood. You might imagine a walk in a wood like this. This is a beech wood in central Italy. And this is how in Japan they write the concept that I will try and talk about, which is shinrin-yoku, and the pronunciation is probably horrible. But it's what gives us the most evidence on the effects of nature on the human body. Shinrin-yoku is usually translated in the West as forest bathing. It's more, the sense of the ideogram is more a sort of immersion, purification. Anyway, it consists in going to a wood or a forest or a suitably natural environment that has to have certain criteria, and spend time there without a real purpose, but just letting yourself be permeated by nature through all the 5 senses. And of course, this was an ancestral practice in many parts of the world, in particular in the Far East. What interests us here is that it became an official medical practice at a certain stage. In the 80s in Japan, the Ministry, I think the Ministry of Health, anyway, ministry, gave it a sort of official status as preventive medicine because it worked empirically. They saw that it worked. So it could happen that you went to the doctor and he would prescribe 3 weeks of forest bathing, or 3 days more likely, but anyway. But what's interesting is that what was also done, besides giving it the official status, was to fund research to validate it and to see why it worked. So we have quite a lot of data on this, and research has been going on for 10 years, even more. We have a lot of information. So what does this research consist of? You can imagine, you take groups of volunteers, take them to a typical forest bathing situation and activities, and you measure a certain number of parameters, and then you do the same thing to the same people in a city situation. Now, the body in a forest bathing situation is actually a number of interesting things happen to our physical parameters such as the heart rate, blood pressure, certain levels of certain hormones in the blood, in the saliva, and so on. Glucose metabolism, for example, also is involved. Not to describe every single item, but what happens is there's a general rebalancing and real harmonization of parameters. In the cardiovascular system, the heart rate is more regular. It slows down if it's too fast. It speeds up if it's too slow. Blood pressure normalizes itself. Everything that regards the autonomic nervous system, that's what basically governs all our automatic organs, the gut, the heart, and so on, also rebalances. Hormone levels are also normalized, especially what we call stress hormones in popular articles. Adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, typically high in stressed urban people, they lower down, and all these changes are lasting. After you leave the wood, it carries on. It's an effect that's actually lasts for a long time. So this is all quite interesting. What's even more interesting is that we have now an idea of what happens to the mind in a forest burning situation. Now, we have all experienced change in mental state due to changing surroundings. You're stressed out, you had a bad day, you say, okay, stop it, I'll go for a walk in a park. And so it's a common experience, the serenity, the peaceful calming effect, the fact that it clears out your thinking. We have a way of saying in Italy, vado a schiarirmi le idee, I'm going out to clear out my thoughts. And this is a thing that's typically done in a natural surrounding. Your brain basically works better afterwards. So we have overall effects on cognition, concentration, and on thinking processes, and on so many aspects of the mind's functioning. Now, what's fascinating is that we now have, besides indirect proof through psychological testing, we have direct evidence on the activity of the brain during presence in the forest. The latest experiments were able to actually use a portable apparatus to see the brain working while walking in the wood. And what's interesting, which is, I think, intercalation, I'm using a bit too much. What's interesting? You'll tell me if it's interesting or not later. But what interested me a lot is, of course, that, as is logical, certain areas of the brain get activated more, and certain areas of the brain are going to get slowed down in a way. Now, the striking part is that the areas that are, in a way, calmed down by when we are out in the woods are those same areas that are totally overworked by modern urban technological lifestyles. So what happens is that our modern, postmodern, hyper-technological urban lives seem to require too much and a constant stimulation of certain specific mental functions, and so certain specific areas of the brain. And overstimulations of these higher mental functions leads to a sort of fatigue of the same functions. In the brain, it leads to an overstimulation of certain areas, in particular the prefrontal cortex. That's a part of what's in pink, not all of it, a part of it. In the forest, there's a calming down, in a way, of this area's activity, and parallelly overactivation, accentuated activation of deeper brain areas that are involved in things such as the state of consciousness, memory, regulation of emotion and well-being, and diffuse attention. So while the overstimulation of higher mental functions that I spoke of has a number of consequences that we experience as what we would call I'm stressed out, I'm burnt out, psychologists call them mental fatigue. These can lead, if they go on and on and on, they can lead to actual mental illness. And forests, parks, gardens, trees tend to rebalance brain functioning and sort of regenerate, give an opportunity to these fatigued mental functions to get regenerated. When I'm talking about overuse and fatigue, I imply also the chance to, in a way, refurbish it if I give it a chance. So it's overworked. If I give it a rest, it will, go back to normal. And that's the best environment for this. Actually, seems to be forest garden environment. What happens to our brain when it's rebalanced in this way is that it enters a functioning that, when it's measured with, for example, a brain and electroencephalogram, is very, very close to something that is willfully only achieved by extreme forms of high-level meditation. It's basically a natural contemplative state. Of course, when it happens to us unwilling, without voluntary action, it's something that will last a few seconds and milliseconds, we'll be barely aware of. Still, nature is something that brings us closer to an experience like this. The human brain and psyche seems to only be able to function well if there's a sufficient minimum amount of nature in our individual and collective lives. And we have lots of evidence of this from psychiatry, from social sciences. I'll spare you the details, but basically, and especially for urban human beings, living in a place like this, the buildings are nothing particularly spectacular aesthetically, but this street has trees, there's a garden at the bottom there, and this makes a significant amount of difference to aspects that go from individual person's frustration, anger, aggressive outbursts, to the functioning as a family, to a child's chances of doing well in education, and to things such as cohesion between neighbors, the sense of community of a neighborhood. So these are so many examples of how important it is to really be aware, not only be aware, but be aware of the weight of the presence of nature in our lives. And if it's so significant even now that we are distancing ourselves so much from it, it's because now the effects of its absence are more and more evident. So why is it that it acts so much, the tree, on us? Well, it seems that nature, in a way, offers a sort of ideal mix of environmental conditions, of stimuli, of inputs, that is just what human life needs. There are probably evolutionary reasons for this. If you think of it, the human species has spent about 99% of its evolutionary history in close contact with nature. We are much more adapted to nature than to anything else. We have evolved biological systems and metabolical systems in close coordination with environmental stimuli from a natural world. So we still need them, and we need them very much. And this is extremely evident in the case of children. Now, in the case of children, the tree archetype has a very strong place, still has a very strong place in all human psyche. Of course, in us adults, it's not so clear, but the tree drawing, of course, is a classic of child psychology, of developmental psychology, and it's so much of a classic that it's even become a diagnostic test, in a way. Of course, this is in the case of children who will draw a tree. Now we are beginning to see children that either when you ask them to draw something, either draw a car as a first thing, or more and more often they don't know how to draw at all, freehand. It's something that's quite alarming for the state of motor coordination, fine motor development. And this brings up the problem of children who grow up with little or no real contact with nature. And by real contact, I mean solid, down-to-earth, daily contact, fussless, just going out and rolling out on the ground and basically touching leaves and it's normal, it's a relationship, it's not something exceptional or something theoretical, abstract. You have children that perhaps will know everything about the Amazon, but they might never have rolled in a bunch of leaves in a park, which is rather shocking. Fact for children is that less and less free time to play, more and more supervised activities and pervasive technology and devices, and all of this is linked to the less nature thing, because all of these activities are antinomic to time spent freely in nature. Well, all this leads to a big problem, because if contact with trees is so important for us adults, it touches our emotions, our psychology, touches our healing processes, and makes us sick if there's too little of it, affects our physiology. You can imagine what happens in children that are so much more sensitive, so much more receptive, and are even growing up. And this is very important, because of course development is something that is regulated by genes, clear, but in constant transaction with the environment. And the environment has to be environment of the right kind, has to give the right stimuli, and a certain minimal amount of stimuli from nature, from trees, from other life forms are essentials. This is a public park in Rome where children often play. I think it's a place I like very much, and it's a place where you see much free play, which is consoling in a way. So it still goes on. Fact is that children with more trees and nature in their lives are usually more advanced on a number of developmental parameters, which is a complicated way of saying how they develop their language, their motricity, how their intelligence grows with the age, and so on. There are several examples of this. It's a rather complicated or rather long talk I should give to explain each one of them, but we could perhaps start with the drawing, since I've started this part with a child's drawing. Drawing is a complex activity that puts together intelligence, perception, memory, what I remember of a tree, motor planning. I have to plan how to put my idea of tree on the paper, and fine motor coordination, which are all things, all capacities that develop with time. A child at 2 will draw differently from a child at 5 or 6, and so on. And now, it seems that all these abilities tend to develop earlier and better in children who have contact with nature to a sufficient extent. A thing that happens also for general motor abilities, which is easy to understand, because a child who usually plays like this will exercise his motor abilities and will be much better at it than a peer, same age peer who doesn't. And also, in fact, there are a lot of consistent data on the effects of contact with nature and general intelligence. Now, of course, intelligence is a controversial concept, but let's theoretically say that it's general intelligence exists, and it's something that can be measured and tested, and it's something that's closely correlated to the quantity of nature, trees, green stuff in a child's life. Now, there could be many reasons for this. Of course, pollution is one. Pollution has an effect on brain. But an interesting thing, there again, I go. The latest study on cognition and nature, contact with nature, has actually tried to analyze this and has seen that the effect is not justifiable only because of air quality. So there are other interactions going on. It's not only that a wood has cleaner air than a city, for example. There's basically a level of dependence of child development on stimuli from natural environment, and this is what I was saying earlier, that nature, a wood, a garden, seems to provide the ideal mix of conditions for in this case, human development. Now, talked about development of intelligence or motricity, all very well. Let's go back to something tangible, the immune system. Because the immune system, which enables us to fight off infection, control and fight off the spread of cancer cells, recognize friend from foe, basically, very complex system, there are increasing evidence, this has been known for years, but now it's basically sure, that its development and functioning is strictly dependent on an adequate early contact with certain balanced microflora, which is only present in a healthy natural environment. So close contact with natural environment, being able to freely play in a park and, to a reasonable extent, of course, is apparently essential if you want to develop a good working immune system. Now, of course, many hypotheses have been developed on why. The main one has a very appealing name. It was called, in its early iterations, it was called the Hygiene Hypothesis. It was a bit extreme in its first statements. It now has been revised and updated with recent data, and it's actually quite reliable. Basically, if it's like the immune system at its beginning is like a computer which has a lot of program but no data. So it must learn, and it learns by contact with the microorganisms that were present during the evolutionary time of man. This is also true for us adults, because this contact, continuing contact, is necessary for us, for example, to renew our gut microbes that are so important for so many aspects of human life. But there are also direct effects of experiencing nature on us adults, for example, direct and quite immediate. Now, in the experiments that were done in the woods of Japan, another aspect that was studied was the counting of a certain number of white blood cells that are involved in the nervous system. These are called natural killer cells, in short, NK. Now, this population of cells is very, very sensitive to stress conditions. So when you're stressed out, you're not sleeping enough, pollution, all these things affect it. Now, a colleague of the main researcher of the other experiments took a number of volunteers, very stressed out people. They were businessmen from Tokyo, if I remember correctly, measured their cells, the number of NK cells, and then took them for a session of forest therapy. And there was a 70% increase in these cells. So, and this again was a lasting effect. It lasted for a number of weeks after they actually had returned to their other life. So you see, there are rather many, the evidence is accumulating, it's a lot, and it's on so many different levels that makes it, quite indicative. Now, of course, there are also things I could say about not only the development of children, but their health, their general health, whether or not they go enough to parks and they play enough in nature and so on. But basically, I'd like to come to the conclusions. As I was saying, there's, besides our common sense, we've all heard that fresh air in the woods or go out in nature, etc. We know it's supposed to be good for us, but there's also experience of millennia, and now we have even large amounts of experimental evidence that it's make us really concerned about the state of things nowadays, because this separation, let's say, between man and nature, the rift is widening, and it's exactly at this moment when modern human being is getting more and more technological, more and more urban. I'll remind you that we have a few years ago, we have passed the halfway point whereby human world population is urban now. More than half of the human population is urban, and we're going towards the 70% mark. A condition, what all this leads to is that apparently a basic necessity, a basic condition for human beings to develop and to function well is a reasonable, a minimal amount of contact and of significant relationship with other living forms. In short, cohabitation, and I'll come back to my initial point. It seems even that some of the features that define us as human depend on this, not only in our physiological structure, the functioning of our bodies, but in things such as intelligence, abstract thought, or aspects such as curiosity and imagination. Some researchers have even developed a theoretical concept to explain this. It's called Biophilia, and it's basically a hypothesis that the human being has a sort of built-in attraction for other forms of life, which actually makes perfect evolutionary sense. If contact with other life forms, if coexistence and cohabitation is essential for our bodies to develop and to function correctly, and our minds and our social relationships, then it makes sense that the human being, from the state of a very small child, will be attracted to other life forms. It's then a cultural necessity to learn which life forms are good, which are dangerous, which you must be careful for. But to have an impulse to go towards, that's rather important. Because, again, our roots are there, our evolutionary roots are there, and we sever them at our peril. And when we sever them, we have an unease, and that easily becomes, from a dysfunction, easily becomes illness, or even worse than that. So, basically, cohabitation is essential. It's essential in different ways for our survival. So both the human-human cohabitation we generally, more generally intend when we use the term cohabitation, but also this I've been long talking about, which is the cohabitation with other forms of life, basically us and trees, as I try to synthesize it. So to borrow again from the Swamp Pavillion manifesto, finding novel ways of coexistence and adaptation, novel forms of coexistence and adaptation. Creating learning interfaces is actually essential. If we take into consideration the effects of lack of coexistence with nature, it makes it vital for us to learn and to adapt. Especially now, at a time in human history when, as I said, living habitats are the habitats human beings live in seemingly are less and less adapted to the life we should be leading. Though, of course, I just wanted to point out that the things in the country are not idyllic, and we have evidence for a problem of relating to nature even in rural areas because of many factors such as intensive agriculture and the spread of certain bad habits of modern lifestyles to all areas of the globe. Basically, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that we must change the lifestyle paradigm. And this is rather complicated to do, but we must learn and adapt from experience, from what we saw are the effects of distance or lack of nature and of coexistence. And the challenge is to create a new way of life which will include this vital cohabitation as a central element. And concurrently, to create a world where this lifestyle is possible with living habitats that include this concept in their planification. So urban nature, sufficient urban nature, of course, and a sufficient preservation of wilderness, because both are essential for the human structure. I conclude by saying that in 2050 there will be 15 billion people on this planet, 50 billion humans. So it does seem that the things I just stated will be one of the great challenges for our future. In a way, contact and relating to nature, cohabitation with nature, seems to be a basic human right. So one of the great challenges for the future is to ensure for everybody this basic human right, along with all the others. That's it. Another tree. Thank you very much.
I'm interested during the whole presentation you were showing flourishing in green nature, but on the last one showed during different seasons. But I was interested how the cohabitation maybe changes during different seasons as the nature somehow in a way dies. So how the good presence of the nature affects people who goes to somehow dead forest during the winter. And maybe some of those scientific tests were made during different seasons, and what were the differences?
That's very interesting. No, it is, and that's a term I use a bit too much. No, I don't have direct data on the differences in seasons, but I do have evidence from anthropological and mythological studies, because of course it's the seasonality of nature and the cycle of life that goes through birth and spring, flourishing life in summer, the bearing of fruit, and then autumn and winter, of course, has symbolized human life in all cultures that experienced seasons. So what's the direct effects I have little data on, except for effects that are also linked, for example, to changes in environmental conditions such as quantity of light, the absence of the effect of the green wavelength. Those are data we have in a but are rather limited to studies that have been done on specific mental conditions and the absence or presence of these. But I think it's something that deeply affects the human psyche, which is expressed also in mythology. Which was only a partial answer.
Sorry for, there is a very good news, in my opinion, is in northern Italy, spreading. There is a project which is spreading nurseries for children in woods.
Oh yes.
And I've already seen 2 of these, and I think it's a fantastic good news.
Yes, that's a fascinating concept. Is the school in the wood, which is very well known in Northern Europe and has only come to us lately. But of course, it takes all its inspiration also from what we know empirically to the effects of nature and of free play in a natural setting, on the very good effects it has on child development. Now this is something that actually should be an obligatory part, I think, of any school system. But now there are schools that actually do a lot or all of their curricular activity out in nature, which is excellent, in my opinion. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do a school of the smarts.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wanted actually to ask you a provocative question. As you're, perhaps I will start with quoting Scholarship Bear, a biologist, who says we are all lichens. So he alludes to the lichen, as you know, that is good evidence of the symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the algae. Right? So the interdependence of each on another. And by calling that what scholarship has in mind, he alludes to the way how the human body functions on the basis of interdependence on microbiota. So he says we cannot say me or I as a single being, but we should say we, right? Because we should take into account and respect all the microbes that are thriving in our body. So we, the team. What he said, like the team scholarship there, or we scholarship there. Giving his on collective example of the body. In your book is called The Tree and Us, right? And I wonder how much you have this sort of dichotomy between not maybe dichotomy, but in a way, this position between the humans and the nature, in a sense that we as a humans constantly, when we're saying humans, right? When we're saying let's recognize intelligence of the plants, or let's recognize intelligence of other beings. There is a sort of tendency to humanize the environment, right? So how much you see problematic in this sort of process of making others humans, right? Maybe on the contrary, we should say maybe we should become trees.
Well, the dichotomy is, of course, it exists, and of course, it has, in a way, there was sort of contagion in my book because I highlighted it in the title, Us and Trees, and I spent good part of the first chapter talking about it, and of course, deploring it and saying that we should actually think in a different way. We should think more about the links that there are. We shouldn't think ourselves outside nature, but part of it, in a way that almost should use the us for everything, not just us humans. But of course, I'm also affected by it. So in writing about all these things, I actually expressed this same dichotomy in a way that's perhaps almost, difficult to avoid when you're studying as a human being. You are studying what's around you, and that for study reasons and for observation reasons you see as a separate thing. I think the consciousness of, for example, the importance of the gut microbes, microlife, and all the other communities of microbes we have in us, that's beginning to be so well known. That's one step that will take us really much closer to not only understanding in an abstract way, but really feeling deep down the community that really exists. I don't know if that's at least partially an answer to the question.
I'm here in Venice. I'm when you show the picture of the hospital.
Yes.
We think about the importance of nature and the recovery of people,
Yes.
ill people in the hospital. And I live here in Venice in the island of Lido. And there we have Ospedale Mare, an old hospital that was built with little pavilions near in front of the sea and with a lot of parks between the pavilions. Then I was made a comparison between this hospital and the new hospital in Mestre, that is very similar in the middle of nowhere, the bad one that we showed in the picture. So I have a question for you, but especially for architects. I was thinking if the Ospedale Mare was built in 1920s. So the idea of sanitary architecture in that period was more innovative, I think, on the architecture of today sanitary buildings. Yeah. Also, Antonio Valentina wrote some books about the history of sanitary architecture in Venice. It's very interesting.
Well, I think by all means it was very innovative, and what's striking is that it's not only hospital architecture, also urbanism. If you think of city planning in late 1900s and perhaps even before, well, public parks and a sufficient number of trees in streets were part of a really modern and innovative city. You couldn't be modern if you didn't have one, which was probably based on ideas of the time, on lots on empirical experience, and also on a perception that perhaps human being has always had of this, the importance of relating to nature. And at the time when cities were growing, it was beginning to be evident that to have a full human life, you had to ensure that everybody could have access to a park. When you see certain neighborhoods that were built for workers, but in very progressively minded municipalities or progressively minded owners of factories that would want to build proper housing for their workers, there were always gardens. So it was really a strong perception that somehow, in many cases, was sort of abandoned on the way in the name of I don't know what. This leads to another really a part of all this is the reflection on how paradoxical our times are, where for a long time the words ecology and sustainability, etc., are more and more used, but then also it's something a bit abstract. And when we're in a city and they raise a garden, raise a garden for making a parking lot, people, yeah, okay, well, we need parking space. No, hang on. It's like, cutting the public water system. It's something that shouldn't happen. Or if it happens, it should be really well planned. You should plant somewhere else. And indifference is one of the aspects of this paradox that leads to things such as the new hospital in Mestre, which, in the case of hospitals, I'm very sensitive to this because it's really so evident. It was something that was known, so why now is it not, and why are old hospitals at least not used as an example? I know that you can't always really use them in the physical places because of many reasons, but they should be at least, lessons should be learned and used. Especially that really, I'm not an architect, but from what I've read, it's something that's increasingly being done in many parts of the world to use therapeutic gardens, lots of green areas around newly built hospitals and so on. Perhaps we'll get to it also here, hopefully. Yeah.
So maybe on this note, with hope in mind, we should really wrap up the presentation, and I really want to thank you, Valentina, and congratulations with your book.
Thank you very much.